Welcome to Marxism, everybody. Sadly, the first message I want to start with is that it's time to sound the alarm, because I think if you look across this week, we've seen the fascists in France, the National Rally, on 33% of the vote in round one, with the second round of the election set to take place on Sunday, where we could well see the fascists winning the election. Of course, today we've got our own general election, where it will be, it will be interesting to see what tonight's results hold, in what I think has been Britain's most racist election campaign in decades. And then, of course, on Sunday we'll still be at Marxism when we begin to see the exit polls, I think just about, coming out from the French election there. So I think that it's the duty of socialists, of anti-racists, of anti-fascists to sound the alarm right now. There's an enormous amount to cover in this discussion, and we have 6 meetings, I think, directly about fascism or the far right, taking place across Marxism, so I'm not going to be able to cover every single aspect of everything in this meeting. But really I think that reflects that right now this urgent question of what is to be done about how we can stop the rise of fascism in the far right is a really central theme for this year's Marxism, and we stand in a bit of a historic moment. Before this week's events, which are quite big, we also had the European election results, which were more evidence of a stark warning. Of course we talked about the position that the fascists and the National Rally in France are in, but also the other far-right fascist Reconquête party led by Eric Zemmour and Marianne Maréchal Le Pen also took 5.5% of the vote in the Euro elections. And of course you had the leader of the right-wing party, Les Républicains, backing an alliance with the far right. In Italy you have the fascist Giorgia Meloni and the Brothers of Italy, sort of descendants from Mussolini's organisation, on 29%. You have the fascist FPO in Austria on a similar number of the votes. In Germany, the AfD, a far-right party where the fascist wing of it is increasingly dominant, on 16% across Germany. And it's worth saying that, as anti-racists and anti-fascists would point out, who's been involved in the mass struggle against the AfD in Germany, that they were polling higher than that. It matters what we do when we try to fight to knock down some of the votes that the fascists can get, but that is still a very, very worrying situation to have, and also the case where you have much closer to 30% in other parts of Germany, in the east and so on. Other headlines, I'm not going to go through the entire European elections here, people can read up about it in Socialist Worker and elsewhere, but the far right took 10% of the vote in Portugal and in the Spanish state. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilders' party took 17% of the vote. The fascists actually lost a seat and so on, but there's that kind of interplay going on there. So it feels like a real shockwave. Fascists in the far right are no doubt about it, on the ascendancy. And although there are some forces, like for example the Sweden Democrats or Wilders' organisation in the Netherlands didn't do quite as well as feared, the general picture overall is one of a really critical, stark warning. And it does feel like a shockwave, but actually we should say that it's not a surprise. We could see the threat of this looming. We could see fascists in the far right being boosted for years by intensifying state racism, by governments and mainstream parties, as they try to use this as a mechanism to deal with the deepening crisis of the system. And so we've seen fascists making gains and being legitimised off that process. And this process of convergence where the same ground is being used by mainstream right parties, racist populists, the far right and the fascists. And that is essentially brutal and aggressive anti-refugee and migrant racism, rampant Islamophobia, which we've seen really, really ratcheted up in the wake of the movement around Palestine, the normalising of the far right, the normalising of anti-Semitic and even fascist ideologies, LGBT plus phobia and violence, hate crimes, violent misogyny, and a very advance of sexist movement, the anti-woke agenda, and a key element of it, the othering and dehumanising and scapegoating of these groups, in particular Muslims, in particular refugees and migrants. And so today we've had the general election in that context. and the far right and racism has completely dominated the campaign. Of course, there's a lot more to talk about in the context of the general election in Britain, and there's other meetings that will go through, the left and the prospects and the pressures and so on that have been exerted by the Palestine movement and lots of other interesting and more hopeful aspects of elements of what's going on in the movement. But I think that we have to say that the election has really been dominated by racism. The racist candidacy of Nigel Farage standing in Clacton has utterly shaped the dynamic to the right. We'll see tonight how that the vile far right Reform UK party, how well they do. We've ran a campaign to stand up to racism, and the SWP's involved in running a campaign inside Clacton to try and fight to stop Farage there. These kind of campaigns are important, but it's quite likely that we can see that they're going to make some gains, and that this will have a profound impact, I think, on shaping the politics of the right in Britain. So this convergence of the kind of hard Tory right, you look at somebody like Suella Braverman, who's directly whipped up fascists on the streets, who's said that Farage should be the leader of the Tory party. There's a realignment that we can see that is going to take place in the wake of the election result, and this could mean a quite positive shift inside British politics. Obviously, we expect that we'll see a Starmer victory, which we do want to celebrate getting the racist Tories out, but actually Starmer has been utterly disgraceful, refusing to back even the safe passage policies, because he deliberately wants to echo and pander to the racism, and across Europe we can see where this path leads. So I think the coming period, even though we hope to see the back of the Tories and all their racist rhetoric and policies spewing out of government, I actually think we expect to see a quite dangerous period where the growth of the far right and fascist forces is a real threat. So meanwhile, we have Tommy Robinson, put the biggest numbers on the street, a fascist, former member of the BNP, leader of the English Defence League and so on. He has put the biggest numbers on the streets on June the 1st this year since his breakthrough and subsequent defeat of that street movement in 2018 around the Football Lads Alliance and so on. And he's calling for fascists, racists, far-right thugs, all that support his movement, to join him in trying to shut down London on the 27th of July. The last mobilisation was disgustingly Islamophobic, horrible racism towards refugees. We have to understand that this climate not only opens up the space for people like Robinson to put those numbers on the streets, but it has a direct impact on, as many in this room will know better than I do, on what it means for people walking around the streets. Women will have their hijab stripped off. People, black people will face racism and attacks. Migrants and refugees will face more and more of the harassment that we've seen the far right trying to whip up for the past 2 or 3 years outside refugee accommodation and so on. So this is a really dangerous climate, and we have to really grasp the nettle and seize the moment and make sure that we move swiftly and quickly to learn the lessons of what happened in the 1930s and make sure that we can build the kind of movement and resistance that can stop this growth here. How am I doing for time?
Fine.
Okay, because I'm not that far in. The role of Sunak's government, of course, and not just Sunak's government, but internationally, you can see this, the role of mainstream governments that have whipped up, whether it's Fortress Europe or whether it's Trumpism in America or and so on. The path has been opened for the far right by an absolutely brutal attack ideologically on refugees and migrants. The numbers of people that have died in the Channel or the Mediterranean and so on, and the complete dehumanisation of those people. We've seen Braverman and Sunak alike have echoed the fascist-inspired Great Replacement theory, and of course they invented the threat of the cenotaph that allowed him to put 2,000 people or so, 1,000 to 2,000 people on the streets at the end of last year as an attempt to undermine and attack the movement over Palestine, attack the left. So this is a bit of an overview, which is a pretty worrying picture from the onslaught of the developments the last few months have given us. And it leads us to ask, with the return of fascists in Europe to this level of influence, and with the backdrop that we're seeing, are we going back to the 1930s? And I think I want to start by hopefully briefly looking a little bit about what fascism is and what's unique about it. I'm not going to do an enormous amount on that because there is, as I say, other meetings. There's a meeting, I think on Sunday that will be taking place and going into that in a lot more detail. But I do think it is important that we define what fascism is and what's unique about it. Because actually in a context where you've got lots of different forces of the right, and racism and the far right and so on, fluidly interacting, using the same slogans and the same grounds, it can be understandable that, you know, people just think, oh God, they're all fascist, or they're all, you know, all these forces are kind of the same thing, you know, do you know what I mean? And you heard that a lot with Trump, you know, the idea that Trump was a fascist and stuff provoked a lot of discussions about clarifying and identifying what the nature of fascism is, and I think that's important. Yeah, as I said, there's a whole, I mean, we'll go through that, people should catch it, but just some of the defining aspects. I mean, most of us obviously have gone through school and will have had some level of education about the Nazis and the Holocaust. I don't know about other people, but for me it really stands out as a child when you get that. It's the same about the history of slavery, to be honest, the way that the sort of mainstream, you know, liberal narrative kind of that's put through our education system just, you know, rightly goes through these horrors, but kind of they just stand alone in history as though, you know, you're not really given a context of how this could happen beyond just a general concept of some people are evil and they're very bad, and well, you know, we did all these things to stop them and so on. Actually, the history of it's greatly distorted. But yes, you know, when you talk about the horror of the Holocaust, it saw the industrialised murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others, including Roma, Black, LGBT+, and disabled people, socialist trade unionists and so on. You know, we don't really have a sense of learning about that, what it is. So I think when we look at the lessons of the rise of fascism from the 20s and 30s, what it shows us is that it's a phenomenon that emerges in counter-revolutionary periods. It's a product of defeated revolutions and a product of a deep crisis of the capitalist system. And so the fascist movements that arose in Italy in the 1920s and Germany in the 30s cloaked themselves from their outset in a kind of anti-establishment mantle that would be familiar to us in some of the language that we see used today on the far right. They sometimes almost, you know, bend towards seeming like they're attacking, you know, the big forces of capitalism and attacking the system, but actually this is a mask. They are not it's not an anti-capitalist movement, it's a product of capitalism. And the goal is to smash the working class, to smash its organisation and its democracy, to break its ability to resist or fight back, and to demand struggle to shape the conditions that it exists in or assert itself in any way as a force with power to shape things. So in reality, fascism emerges in the interests of big business when the depth of the crisis means that the political parties of liberal democracy are failing to protect its interests, and this is like in times of deep crisis we see this playing out. The ushering in of fascism was the last resort of the capitalist ruling class as a means to crush the threat of a workers' revolution, or even damage, you know, the damage that can be inflicted on ruling classes' interests by a continually combative working class. And so in both the cases of Mussolini's rise to power in Italy in 1922 and Hitler in Germany in 1933, the truth is they were actually handed power willingly by the state and the existing political forces of the capitalist class. You know, and in many cases having bankrolled these movements and provided immunity for their violence that allowed them to build up the street movements that they had when they went to power. So you know, this is it's something that comes out of the needs of big business, of capitalism, and of the capitalist class, and in their interests. But its social base is the middle class, really. You know, small business owners, managers, you know, at that time lawyers, doctors, state functionaries, self-employed tradespeople, and you know, at that time, you know, to varying degrees in Italy and Germany, sections of the peasantry that, you know, owned some of the land and so on. That this kind of social layer, at moments, you know, Marx talks about it, it's kind of vacillating. You know, it can at times be pulled into the mass struggles of progressive movements when they're in the ascendancy and seizing the initiative, and when you know, revolutionaries can fight for programmes that fight to win those sections or break their ability to assert their own initiative. But they can also play a reactionary role, aligning with the ruling classes, aligning with big business in the defence of the system. And so, yes, Marx talked about how beings determines consciousness, how your material relationship to production and to the society around you, your experience of it, shapes your ideas. And the working class has such a relationship where it's organised collectively, it's shaped by how the system propels it into collective struggle against its exploitation. And of course that doesn't always happen. You know, you have times where, you know, at the moment, like, workers are mostly not conscious of the collective power and collective interests in that way, and the state is always coming up with ways to try and cut against that, racism being one of the biggest ones to divide people. But that there is this kind of this relationship to the system. But the middle class is not engaged in that sphere of collective class interest, and instead is shaped more by a sense of individual interest, property, defence of property, a relationship where it aims to profit in some way from capitalist relations and an aspirational mentality for profit. And so, as a result, it can very much, these ideas can very much lead to it sort of identifying its class interest as very separate from the working class. You can often have it pitched at times in tension with big business and the ruling class, which controls and shapes the arena that it tries to prosper. But in moments of crisis, you can see how that with the crisis deepening today, it can become part of sort of resistance to the system, or it can become part of an anti-establishment feeling. For example, if you look around the pandemic, the way that the middle classes and small businesses and so on were hit by the pandemic and the emergence of anti-vax movements and so on, you could see how it was driven by its sort of social base into that role. The scale of the crisis in the 1920s and the 1930s was so extreme that the middle class was hammered and decimated by a very sharp transformation in its material conditions. Interest wrecking its savings, lost profits and wealth, the impact of the devastation of the World War, returning soldiers to unemployment, no jobs for young students and workers alike. And so in these decades you're really seeing a mass discontent among the middle classes, and this forms the social basis for the fascist movements that emerged. But they were decisively propelled, funded and protected and eventually handed power by the ruling classes, by the capitalist class. And so the classical fascist strategy that succeeded in Italy and Germany combines the building up of a kind of aggressive mass street movement, the shock troops that terrorised and sought to break organised working class and the socialist movement, which started out with the kind of the gangs that Mussolini and Hitler were part of, many of these bands that were used to kind of go in and terrorise organised workers and break strikes and so on. But yes, it sort of combines that with an attempt to have an electoral strategy to seek to achieve normalisation and respectability. And across Europe and internationally, in the wake of the sort of catastrophe and barbarism of the First World War, it was a time where you had the most spectacular revolutionary moments and mass struggles. In 1917, actually the forces of reaction, counter-revolution, did attempt to smash it in the middle of it, and people can go to other meetings about the history of the revolution, but during the course of the revolution you had the threat of the Kornilov coup, where the forces of reaction were marching to smash up the revolution. And it was a moment really in the revolution that enabled the Bolsheviks to work broadly and effectively with the masses of workers to stop the fascist coup and the counter-revolution, where they talked about we'll put our rifles on the shoulder of Kerensky from the provisional government and so on, of forces that we were in a sharp tension with about the course of the revolution and the course of the struggle, but we'll lean our weapons on his rifle to take out the forces of fascism and so on with Kornilov, and then we'll decide after that what we do with our rifles in relation to Kerensky. And so this, I think, was a kind of an early sort of experience of a united front method in the struggle, which is it's not just a method of softening your politics, not raising your revolutionary demands as a socialist and so on, but going in and adapting to the sort of reformist strategies and so on of other forces. It's actually about entering a relationship that is about action and is about mass action, moments that you can shape things, where you're working to win over working class people who maybe are not fully convinced of the need for a revolution yet as a solution to the crisis of capitalism, but are engaged in fights in the here and now, whether it's about strikes or mass struggles like that, or whether it's about critically the question of how you stop the rise of fascism. And so anyway, across the world, workers are looking to the victory of the Russian Revolution. There's mass strikes, there's struggles, there's a revolutionary spirit that's caught alight. But unlike in Russia, the forces of social democracy, the reformist socialist parties, the trade union leaderships and bureaucracies that were heavily entrenched, that this was a different picture. They were very heavily entrenched in places like Germany and also in Italy. And as a result, it meant that for socialists and revolutionaries who were trying to seize these revolutionary moments and shape the combative workers' struggles towards victory, these were being posed on quite a different terrain in some ways to what had happened in Russia. And the hold of reformist ideas and the organisation there was much stronger among the mass of workers. And I don't know how much I'm going to get to do with this, but I do advise that people read up about the history of the lost German Revolution, and people read up about the factory movement in Italy and so on. I'm going to try to get through some of the brief lessons of that before I come back to today and look at some of the differences and some of answer the question of the meeting. But I think it is important because there's lessons that come out of those struggles, and it's really the failed revolution in Germany is what paved the way for the rise of fascism in Germany, and likewise in Italy. The missed opportunities that could have been built out of the factory occupation movement, the Vienna Rosso, around 1920, those missed moments were what led to the forces of reaction being able to get on the front foot and led to the opening up of the ability of the fascists to seize the initiative. So yes, really trying to boil down the enormous topic of the failed German Revolution into a couple of sentences. Essentially, there was a revolutionary kind of moments that came up in 1918 to 1923, and when presented with the outbreak of mass struggles, strikes, mutinies, the creation of Soviets, the German revolutionaries were not really large enough or having enough influence inside the wider working class movement, having only just formed the Communist Party and so on, led the Spartacist uprising in early 1919, which, with the support of the reformist SDB, was crushed by the Freikorps, the right-wing paramilitary squad that, much like what was evolving in Italy on the streets, these violent sort of forces of reaction. And then the Freikorps went on to also murder Luxemburg and Liebknecht, the revolutionary leaders of that struggle. So this was obviously a pretty terrible moment. In March 1921, I've put 2021 in my notes. March 1921, that's why I'm confused. The Communist Party attempted to turn a defensive strike by miners into a kind of insurrection for state power. And again, this was quite a disastrous move. There wasn't enough ground won inside the working class movement, and so from then up till about 1923, the new Communist Party seeks to lead united front struggles against the attacks on the left, workers' organisation, drawing in workers who are still influenced by reformist ideas and drawing them into a common struggle, and appeals to the SPD leadership to say, we need to build united mass action on the streets against the growth of the fascists and the attacks on the left. But the SPD leadership, refuses to get involved in that. But on the ground, this kind of is developed and taken up. And as a result, the Communist Party grows in this period by around 40,000 members. The SPD losing a kind of similar number. And then in 1923, a real revolutionary moment opens up again. The deepening of the economic crisis led to mass strikes, and now you have a Communist Party with a big enough level of support and sort of carrying arguments inside the working class movement. But it sort of makes the opposite mistake as it had, and under pressure from not being able to win the reformist forces to go with it, it doesn't seize the revolutionary moment. And so you now have a ruling class that's had its system brought to the brink by the power of the working class, and with capitalism entered into an even deeper crisis that's thrown up all these tensions and questions. And so the ruling class looks to the counter-revolutionary forces that had been used to crush the 1919 uprising. These begin to grow. And so the Nazis started out as one of these leagues that Hitler was involved in and so on. And through these years, the Nazis sort of absorbed the others and inspired by the Italian fascist movement, where Mussolini had done the same. I'm not going to say as much about Italy because I'm going to run out of time. But in Italy, fascism established power in the aftermath of 2 years of incredible levels of mass workers' struggle, that if it had been developed rather than left to defeat by the reformist Italian Socialist Party, the trade union leadership and so on, if that had been developed, it could have instead led to the opposite outcome of opening up the possibility that you could lead to revolutionary moments in the workers' movement on the ascendancy, which would have helped to keep the far right in check and would have allowed the left to seize more of the initiative. But in both cases, the rise of fascism was a process of aftermath of a devastating war, growing unemployment, as I said, the economic crisis, and really crucially, the defeat of revolutionary moments or mass struggles that gave the social base of fascism that impetus to seize the initiative in the vacuum. And so not only did the atrocious role that was played by the reformist leadership mean that the potential for real change, a real break from the savages of the capitalist system for workers was thwarted, but it also meant that catastrophically they were extremely complacent and dismissive of the threat of fascism. In cases, the examples in Italy are shocking. Encouraging inaction, calling on workers to stay at home. Encouraging a trust in the state to deal with the forces of fascism, even though they were actually, sort of funding them and arming them and so on. As Mussolini's black shirts took to the streets, they attacked and murdered socialists. They seized the initiative, and Hitler's brown shirts did the same. And not without attempts to stop that. There were heroic anti-fascist attempts and actions, but that failure to kind of build that broad united resistance that went out and confronted it on the streets and so on was a catastrophic decision. So it's a searing lesson for us today, I think, that we need to build mass, united anti-fascist and anti-racist movements to strangle the prospect of the growth of fascism before it's grown and gained any foothold. And it's quite chilling that Hitler said himself, only one thing could have broken our movement if the adversary had understood its principle and from the first day had smashed it with the most extreme brutality, the nucleus of our new movement. That's what we have to do. That's what we have to do now. That's what communists have to fight to do in France, in Germany, in Austria, and so on. Is what we have to continue to try to do. In contrast to the strategy of the United Front, which was outlined by Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, he stressed the importance of this method of uniting in action with reformists on the streets, and in the process trying to win workers who were still committed to reformist ideas and so on away from those ideas and more convinced of a way that could actually win successfully. But unfortunately, the rise of Stalinism, the Communist Party's line in the 30s really flip-flopped from one catastrophic position to another, and this shaped the interventions of the new Communist parties and so on as they were. And if you look at France in 1934 to 1938, you saw mass strikes, factory occupations, incredible resistance that I wish I had more time to talk about, but I think other people will at other meetings. You also saw resistance to the attempts of the fascists to grow off the back of Hitler's victory. And the Communist Party at that point were at a stage where they were describing the Party of Social Democracy, the kind of Labourist party, as left-wing fascism, twins of the Nazis, and called. There was not a unity that was being built there across the forces of the left, and they called an anti-fascist demonstration in early 1934 without involving any broader forces, and it was attacked by the police. 6 protesters were killed. So you have this situation where really the need for unity was kind of forced by the situation, and the Communist Party then backed a kind of trade union day of action that was called by the Socialist Party, and you had the depth to which there was not a level of unity existing was that the two groups approaching square from separate sides. I'm not sure how that process would go, but actually when the crowds met, there were these kind of outbreak of joy and calls of unity like from the workers and so on that had joined the marches. That this sense of almost the pressure from below and the absolute dire necessity in the situation for there to be some united struggle. So Trotsky talked about this as saying in terms of the alliance of united fronts versus kind of popular fronts, election agreements, parliamentary compromises serve as a rule to benefit, essentially the reformists and the system, and instead stressed on an emphasis of practical agreements for mass action for the purposes of struggle. So if you look at something like our involvement in something like Stand Up to Racism or gegen Rassismus in Germany or March to Solidarity in France and so on, you have a situation where you have revolutionaries involved in broader campaigns, but the focus is about getting out onto the streets. The focus is about building that mass action. The danger with the the kind of Popular Front strategy, which the Stalinists then in the 30s in France shifted. There was a U-turn where it was insisted that this kind of Popular Front strategy was developed, but it had disastrous consequences and a terrible role in kind of quashing like the workers' resistance, declaring times for pauses, and so on. This was a kind of far cry from the method of revolutionaries building unity and action on the streets, while maintaining their independence as a revolutionary organisation that can say what needs to be argued on other questions, or on the questions of how you fight fascists itself. So, just to kind of come to the end of the meeting, I think if you look to France currently, you can see that danger of the Popular Front strategy is that it ties it has the danger of threatening to tie the radical and revolutionary voice, which is trying to relate to the deep disillusionment that has led to the rise of the fascists, the centre, collapsing, the fact that what's been on offer previously has led to the level of disillusionment that has seen the rise of the vote of the far right. If revolutionaries are tied in a position where they can't put that argument up around the election and talk about the need to fight fascism in the context of what it has grown out of and the system that it's grown out of, then it's like you're having your hands tied behind your back. And I think this is something that obviously is going to be a very big discussion at Marxism, given what's happening in France at the moment, because there's a huge question posed to people in France about what you do on Sunday and how to keep the fascists out. But I think any impetus that pulls back towards the kind of mainstream centre parties that have utterly failed and gives them back the initiative is a real problem, and will not deal with the solution. So I think we have to have a real focus, as the French comrades have, about getting onto the streets, building the movement in the workplaces, building that mass united front action against the fascists, but also as socialists, as revolutionaries, fighting on all those other issues that have led to the disillusionment that's created the rise of the far right. And that's something that I think we have to generally look to in how we confront, wherever we are in the world, how we confront the threat of the return of fascism. Just to leap back to today, I will promise I will finish very soon. This is just the last bit. I mean, the founder of the SWP, Tony Cliff, had said in the 1990s that he described the situation like the 1930s playing out in slow motion. And he said the fact that the film is returning in slow motion means that there's a greater chance to stop that film and direct it differently. And it's been said before, but the huge events of this week and this month really underline it so clearly that I'll say it again. That film is speeding up. Are we returning to the 1930s? Well, there are some important differences for us to take stock of in relation to the growth of fascism today, and history doesn't repeat itself twice in the same way, but I think it definitely is the case that we are closer than we have been ever since to the situation of the 1930s. A key difference is that the terrifying advances that the fascists are making electorally right now in Europe is it's shaped, the way that they can do that is shaped by the space and ability for them to organise, and how that's been limited coming out of the aftermath of the Second World War and the horror of the Holocaust. Their brand has been toxic. They sort of seek political legitimacy, normalisation, and sanitise their image, which has always been part of the fascist project, and Mussolini and Hitler pursued the same, but the extent of that now is much greater. The impact of that means that they don't have the shock troops on the ground, they don't have the street armies. There's also a question to how much the big business, the big capitalist sections of the ruling class are, breaking with liberal democracy and looking to the forces of fascism. These aspects are different, I think, at the moment, which gives us more time. But we don't have a lot of time. And if you have a situation where you have Prime Minister in Italy who's a fascist, where you have parties governing in France that are fascist, where you have the election coming up in Austria as well, do you know what I mean, where the fascists have done well, this kind of situation can enable it enables them much more space to be able to shift and develop those kind of things.
The SWP's played, I think, a pretty commendable role over the last 40 years in terms of building united fronts against fascism. I don't want to talk about that here. We need to look at that in detail, we need to learn the lessons of it. I want to say something about Portugal, actually, bizarrely, and the dangers of complacency on the left. Because I was fortunate enough to go to Portugal at the 50th anniversary of the Portuguese Revolution for the celebrations. And it was an extraordinary day. It was a wonderful day. 150,000 people on the streets of London. You know, that is a huge bloody demonstration. And it was a day devoted to politics. In the morning, me and my son ran the Corrida da Liberdade, which is the run of freedom. A political run, interestingly enough, following the tracks of an army unit that went from the outskirts of Lisbon into the centre. Now, there's a little warning, I think, on that run for us, because people will know, people will heard, I think, of Chega, the fascist party in Portugal. Now, the month before that, they had quadrupled their vote. They have got 50 deputies in the National Assembly in Portugal. They are a real and present danger. They articulate that vile anti-immigrant rhetoric, the most vile anti-GRT rhetoric, which is something that matters a lot in Portugal. Now, as my son and I raced down the track of it, we looked around us. On every lamppost of the first part of the route of this run, there were Chega posters. Now, comrades, what would have happened here had we been doing that run? We would have torn the bloody things down. Everybody ignored them. Everybody completely ignored them. I spoke to my daughter-in-law, who's a supporter of the left bloc, and I said, I can't believe that happened. She said, I hope people aren't going to raise anti-Chega slogans today, because that is giving them too much credit, because the 50th anniversary of the Portuguese Revolution is our day. Now, on the demonstration in the afternoon, everybody was chanting, April 25th forever, fascismo nunca mais, fascism never again. Was there a single slogan raised against Chega? I'm sorry to tell you, comrades, there was not. Was there a single placard condemning Chega as a fascist threat? I'm sorry to tell you, comrades, there was not. Now, that is not to say that, we're wonderful here and the Portuguese left are terrible. There are lots of, heroic fighters on the Portuguese left, but it is a lesson in complacency. It's a lesson in absence. It shows us two things. It shows us that the Portuguese left have a big job of work to do. They have to confront racism, because actually you looked at the demonstration in the afternoon and it was signally lacking in African faces. And there was, as I say, there was no attempt to take Chega on. There's a lesson, there's a job of work for the Portuguese left to do, but actually it's a negative lesson for us. We might not have always got it perfectly right, but we've been bloody trying for the last 40 years, and actually we have had an effect. The SWP pushing those things has had an effect. The tragedy thus far in Portugal is that there is not as yet any significant tendency aligned to our tradition. The bloody one needs to be one built quickly, because there's a job of work to do there.
So, comrades, these are some of the headlines that were on Monday's news the day after the elections in France. French stock market surges and euro gains as investors eye hung parliament. Euro hits two-week high after first round of France's elections. France CAC 40 index surges 2.6 in the early trades. In other words, the markets loved it. The markets loved the response of the rise of the fascists, the strong showing that the fascists made in the French elections. This was from the Financial Times a week before, in the run-up to the election. And this was a quote from a CAC 40 company director. This is the equivalent of FTSE 100 in France. And he says, the RN, the fascists' economic policies, are more of a blank slate that business thinks they can help push in the right direction. The left is not likely to water down its hardline anti-capitalist agenda. And another one leading French entrepreneur, argued the left's economic programme would amount to France leaving the capitalist system. I mean, that's absurd, but this is how they're seeing the vote and whatever. And final quote, this is from a company that tells the super rich what to do with their money and what they can do with it. Our high-end clientele are asking themselves a lot of questions after the election. The question we are most frequently asked is my money safe in France? They're not asking if black people are safe in France, they're not asking if Jewish people are safe in France, they're not asking if Muslim people are safe in France. It's their money. And that's one of the major links, that the bourgeoisie are warming to the idea of French fascism and beyond. And another thing that links the 30s, I think, to today is there are huge anti-fascist movements on the streets. I've worked with my colleague is a German Her mother is in Frankfurt. Her mother is in her mid to late 80s, and she was proud that her mother was one of the people who took to the streets earlier this year when it was revealed that the AfD were in discussions with the Austrian identitarians about deporting what they see as non-Germans, black Germans and Turkish Germans to North Africa. Huge demonstrations in France as well. My sister's a French citizen. She has 4 adult French children. They've been told that they may actually lose their citizenship if the fascists get in. Absolutely huge mobilisations, but mobilisations without activity, without confronting the fascists, without uniting together, it's not going to cut it. And that's what we need to be arguing all the way down the line, that it's not just passive demonstrations, it's got to be confrontational demonstrations, it's got to be the badge that these are Nazis and we are not going to go back to it. We say never again, we'll keep that promise.
Yeah, I come from France and Morocco, so let me give you my perspective. I voted online this morning, of course, for the Popular Front, and I can tell you that you will have Keir Starmer, we will have a Popular Front. There's no doubt about that. But the thing is that, after Keir Starmer, if people are disappointed about his policies, which I think, from a French point of view, Keir Starmer is not left, he's centre. The Tories are not right. They are probably much more between right and far right. So we view the political vote, we view as French people and British people is completely different. And I'm also a teacher, and I was shocked. Let me tell you, I was shocked by my colleagues who are teachers who didn't vote Corbyn. And it was just unbelievable for me. And they said it. They said if we voted for him, we're going to go back, like the media said, we're going to go back to communism. So really shocking. I think what's happening in France is that there's a lot of protests. I don't know if it's been broadcast here, but the Yellow Vest movement has been really strong for 2 years. Macron was really scared at some point, he even said to Yellow Vest, come and get me, and they did. So they went with a forklift and smashed the door of the Élysée Palace, and Macron was not there. Of course, he escaped somewhere underneath or overboard, I don't know. So I think we've got a really strong socialist, basis in France that I don't see here. I see it in the middle class, but not so much in the working class. So that's something we need to look at really when I go to socialist workers' parties meetings, I don't see really working classes people. And that's a problem because it's all about education. If they only look at the media propaganda, it's all owned by billionaires in France. The reason Macron was elected, well, first because he's a young global leader, and he was chosen, of course, like all of the leaders that we are governed by. But the media in France, it's all owned by billionaires, like here. And so if you have Fox News 24 hours saying, the Arabs are stealing your jobs, the Arabs are this, that, of course they're going to vote for Jordan Bardella. Jordan Bardella is an immigrant. His parents are from Algeria and Italy.
Oh my God. No.
Yeah. Oh yeah. They looked through all his history, and it's that. So France is very much cosmopolitan. It's not just French people. It's Arab like me. It's French. It's Polish. It's all of that. It's our wealth. It's part of that. But the fact that French people cannot go on holiday, don't have a decent wage, like the Yellow Vests movement said, decent wage, decent life, decent life. So the fact that they don't have that, and Macron is Thatcher, yeah? Macron is destroying everything. So, we are going through what you are going through with what you went through with Thatcher, but it's all that. All the NHS is destroyed, education, don't even think about it. And if you don't have education, you have nothing. If people are not educated, they're going to vote Jordan Bardella, of course. But I think I'm really, I think that for what's his name now? Because all the parties have been together. Remember, in France, you've got also an anti-capitalist party joined by I can't remember his name because I forget now. I'm here. But they all joined together, the Greens, the anti-capitalists, the socialists, everyone together just to be against Jordan Bardella. And remember, there's going to be 300 triangulars this Sunday. And so the Macron and Mélenchon, the left guy, said that if my candidate is the weakest, I'm going to desist. So there's not going to be any surprise. We know that it's not going to be Jordan Bardella. It's always close because people in France, you know, they are not happy about the policies of course, you shouldn't vote for National Front, but because they just want to send a message to say, you know, we've got enough of this. But that's not good. That's not good because the Arabs, like me, when we go out, you might have problems, you might be killed, or you know, things like that. So fingers crossed, all good.
Carola from Barcelona, member of Marx 21, the SWP sister group, and also an activist in United Against Fascism and Racism in Catalonia, and also one of the coordinators with Julie of World Against Racism, that we're trying to spread this sort of idea. Two brief things then. One about differences between fascism in the 1930s and now, that's been touched on, Julie touched on, that then they had mass street armies. Hitler had hundreds of thousands of thugs in the street. Now it's much more electoral, but that can change very fast, as you've seen in Britain with Tommy Robinson. In the Spanish state, at the last European elections, Vox got a lot of votes, but there's also an organisation that has lots of young men that do martial arts. They're radically Islamophobic, transphobic, Spanish centralist, they hate migrants. They come from a Stalinist background, but they now sit down and talk with fascists, and their rhetoric is basically fascist. And they are potentially dangerous on the street. I mean, they threaten trans activists and so on. So the second thing is about anti-fascism. With some of the news from France and so on, just about everybody vaguely progressive declares themselves anti-fascist. But as Julie pointed out, that can mean very different things. It can mean saying we all have to vote for Chirac, or we have to withdraw candidates in favour of Macron, or I read a thing in Socialist Worker, Darmanin, who's proposed this horrible racist law, and the radical left withdraws, so he has better chances of winning. I mean, for me, this is horrible. That's one that comes from the Popular Front, which is Stalinism from 1934 to 1939. And the other one, radical Antifa with a red flag, comes from Stalinism, 1928 to 1934, that allowed Hitler to win because they rejected any collaboration with reformists. So the Communist Party had hundreds of thousands of members. It's not like radical left now, you have 100 members, and you say, we're going to beat fascism. They had hundreds of thousands of members, but it wasn't enough to stop the Nazis. The other strategy, which is what we defend in our tendency in Britain, in Germany, in Greece, and everywhere, is united struggle against fascism. Whereas with the Popular Front, you all have to agree with a reformist liberal program. The radical Antifa, you have to agree with some sort of radical sectarian program of the Communist Party or anarchist groups or something. With the United Front, you don't have to agree on a program at all. We work together against the fascists, we work together against racism, and we agree to differ. We can go with our own flags, we can go with our own newspapers on the demo. We have a united placard, banner at the front, and behind that we can have all sorts of differences. We fight for that in our tendency of our small group in the Spanish state. In fact, we started United Against Fascism and Racism in Catalonia. We have 700 organisations, all the unions, most of the left, labour's organisations, black organisations, Muslim organisations. Nothing like that exists in most of the Spanish state because none of the radical left understand that. We've had contact with people in Portugal, that Michael earlier talked about Portugal. We've had contact with people in Portugal, and there was some attempts to have some sort of united movement, but at the end of the day there wasn't a group of people that understood that way of working. It was all, either you agree with reformism, or people have to agree with your radical program. No. We can build something broad, but at the same time, we need an alternative to capitalism because it brings us to disaster. So for that, we need a radical anti-capitalist option of socialism from below. but also to build those united movements. It's not easy. If you're on your own, you get tired, you get worn out. If you have a group of people that understand that, not people saying, well, let's join the reformists, or let's tell them to all piss off because we don't like them. You need support to build that, which is why events like this today, impressive, the first event, 1 o'clock on a Thursday, it's impressive to have the room full. We need more people in Britain in the SWP, in the Spanish state in Marx 21, people in Portugal building something similar, people in France helping to build our group there, because without that, we are stuffed. With that, we can stop the fascists today, and we can start building an alternative for the future.
Thanks, Julie, for a really clear analysis there of what fascism actually is, because I think it's important that we say that fascism isn't just like, very extreme forms of racism and that, like right-wing populism like Farage or Trump or whatever, but it is, this movement that actually seeks to smash all working class democracy. And it's important that we have this analysis not just what we can call out fascists for who they are, but it also informs how we fight fascism. Julie spoke about the United Front, and the United Front isn't something that means, conceding on our politics or dropping differences. It's actually about, pulling the movement together on what we agree on, uniting people against racism, and about marginalising the fascists, both in politics and by confronting them on the streets. And it's also about creating a wedge, between hardcore Nazis and some of their softer elements, about people who will hold some of the racist and authority ideas and so on. But I think that this is contested tactics. Some people have spoken about the Popular Front or types of autonomous organisations and so on. But if you look at organisations in Britain like Hope Not Hate, this is an organisation that does good work by identifying different fascists and so on. But really their strategy and their argument is about leave the fascists alone and the state will deal with them. I think it's pretty clear that we can see that the state will not be dealing with the fascists for us. We cannot rely on the police or the courts or so on. They're more likely to be locking us up. The anti-fascists. And I think that's why it's necessary that we argue for people to actually get to the streets against fascism, and why it's incredibly important that that people are en masse. Trade unionists, anti-racist activists, students and so on, go onto the streets on, in July on the 27th against fascist Tommy Robinson and taking him on in that way. But I also think that, in terms of contested tactics, that we don't concede to, concede to forms of racism in an attempt to, relate to maybe some of the softer elements on fascist demos and so on. This does nothing to split off racist or softer elements from the hardest elements of this kind of movement. But I think these ideas are also based, we've seen them in protests in Connecticut, for example, which hopefully some other comrades will speak about. But I think this is based on the acceptance that the white working class is racist, or that that there are genuine concerns about refugees and so on. I think we have to reject that. We have to argue that we take on the racism wherever we see it, and we always stand with refugees and the most oppressed people in society. But also we have to believe and have faith that as socialists that we can win working class people to anti-racism. And that we also think that that the whole working class, including white workers, is not in their interest to be divided against, our common enemy, which is, the rich and bosses and so on, not migrants, refugees, or Muslims. And I think this is actually our biggest hope, that it's not the benefit of white workers, that, working class people can be united, and this is the force to break down racism. This is our biggest hope against the far right and the fascist threat that we see at the moment. But this unity is clearly not automatic. White people do hold racist ideas, white workers can go against their interests and so on. So it is the argument of socialists, of revolutionary socialists and so on, and people who are involved in the United Front to be arguing in a maximum way for this unity. And I don't know how much time I've got left.
Well, not much.
Okay. But I think just to end, I've been part of campaigning with anti-racism against Nigel Farage in Clacton. I'm not calling Farage a racist. I think he belongs to this kind of populist right wing. He takes his arguments off.
Well, he is racist.
Oh, sorry, he's not a fascist, he's a racist right-wing populist, sorry. He's not a fascist, he's a racist right-wing populist, modelled off of Trump and so on. But I think the most annoying thing about going down to Clacton is not actually, meeting racists or people saying they're going to vote for Arden reform, but it's actually the way that, the press kind of shows that Clacton is just this place that's a total write-off, we'll never win them, they're all working class, they're all white, they're all stupid. If this was our approach, we would have no hope of combating Farage and Clacton. I think it's important that even the outcome of the election, that we have been down there to identify the anti-racists there, to give them hope in fighting back against Farage and arguing with people to not vote for Reform UK. And I think this is part of what we have to be doing as well, is at this time when politics is going into despair and down the gutter and so on. As revolutionary socialists, we need to be, arguing in a maximum way to be building the United Front, but also creating the hope, which is the alternative to, the crises and the things that breed the far right in the first place.
Hi everyone, my name is Matthew. I'm a comrade from France, French activist, anti-racist and anti-fascist. Thank you very much for this very, very useful discussion. And I just want to address some points that I think are really important right now in the discussions in France. And have in mind the 30s is really something that we need to go into detail. I'm sorry, my English is not very good.
Very good.
First, in France, believe me, right now, there is a huge tendency to see fascists as nothing more than something a little more racist, a little more autocratic than Macron, and it's a huge, huge mistake. Yeah. They completely miss the point that the 30s has learned us, that fascist is a really specific threat, and as the comrades said before, two of them speaking about Portugal and what they see in France as well, we need unity in action. We don't need unity in votes. We won't destroy fascists by voting. We know that, we have learned that, and this is sad, but this is the mistake that France is doing again right now. It's not meaning that we have lost, but it's a mistake we are doing right now. And there is of course Macron is racist. Of course capitalists are racist. But they put racist law and they wait for police to apply it. There is a huge difference. Right now we see it in France. When fascists are on the rise, they put their militias on the streets. We have never seen so much racist attacks than in the last weeks. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare, believe me. And it's really something we have to fight. Secondly, we lack in France anti-racism and solidarity with migrants. That is the main reason why fascists are on the rise right now. We have nothing on the left against racism, nothing on the left with solidarity with migrants. We are building from below. It's a difficult task. We have nothing against Islamophobia. It's like, as I strongly disagree with the comrade before that says that people are voting for Rassemblement National because they are angry. When you are angry, you don't vote, you vote for Mélenchon. If you vote for Front National, it's because you are racist. That's it. And as well, something else. Of course, we have seen in the 30s that fascism, they are put in control by capitalists, of course. But they have a level of autonomy that we never need to forget. For example, for years in France, one of the billionaires that was founding the fascist named Bolloré, he has media and so on, his main fascist favorite was Zemmour. Zemmour is now swept by Rassemblement National because fascists are autonomists. They have their own autonomy against capitalists. They have their strategy and we need to fight them in action. We have Saturday morning a comrade from France that will speak about Front Populaire, and I strongly invite you to attend.
I just want to sort of ask a question, or I think a lot of people will be thinking, why are we seeing fascism rise again? And I think, to put it bluntly, it's because of the fact that capitalism drives crises. When you get crises, you get resistance, and then you get cracks down on that resistance, right? I think what we saw that looking like in the 30s, well, it was the First World War, which was this huge conflict, huge bloody mistake that saw so many people dragged to their graves, and then of course the Great Depression that followed it, and then of course also the spread of Bolshevism and workers' insurgency across Europe. This is what saw the rise of Hitler and Mussolini, because the capitalist system needed this battering ram to smash any sort of worker or liberal democracy whatsoever, not censor it or ban it, but outright smash it. I think today what that looks like, though, we don't have the First World War and the Great Depression, but we do have our equivalent. It's what Marxists call the polycrisis. It's the fact that we've got this huge cost of living crisis, that we've got climate change getting worse than ever, the fact that we've just gone through a massive pandemic that put millions of people into their graves, right? And I think we need to understand as well that, yeah, this is absolutely awful and everything, but some people might be thinking, well, that in and of itself isn't enough to maybe necessitate massive workers' insurgency, because of course we've not quite seen that yet, and then maybe that means we're not going to get fascism as well. But I think we need to be clear as well that this is going to keep getting worse. I mean, I think about the generation before me, they grew up in a nice post-war economic boom. For anyone my age, I'm 24 for reference, we've grown up through the 2008 financial crash, we've seen Trump come in, we've seen Brexit, we've had 14 years of the Tories, we've had COVID, and now we're getting Israeli genocide. And I think we need to be clear as well. You know, look at what Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak are saying. They're talking about the threat of Russia coming further in, of winning the Ukraine war. You're having Keir Starmer saying, I'm ready to keep my finger on the nuclear button and be ready to press it if it really comes down to it. And you're having Rishi Sunak talking about national service, an absolutely ridiculous thing. But I think we need to recognise this rhetoric for what it is. It's trying to push things to the right. It's then getting ready for the crisis getting even worse. So I think we need to be aware as well that when it does get worse in the next 20, 30 years, we need to be prepared for fascism to really come back and to be ready to fight it before it gets a chance to, right? But I think we need to be aware that fascism is going to look different this time. It already does look different. We know quite clearly from the 1930s and 40s that fascism is bad. It's got this pariah status, right? So they can't really come through the same way that we did before. But you see it operating as what Robert Paxton, a historian who looks at fascism, talked about as being a political shapeshifter. The fact that it doesn't really have any coherent ideology, but will instead twist around to find success in any way that it can. And you can see back in the 30s, when the Nazis rose to power, they already adopted what's called a dual strategy. You had Hitler saying, we'll either outshoot or outvote the communists, whatever happens first. And you saw that they outshot them first. I don't think that's going to be the same this time. It is going to be outvoting, right? It is going to be the fact that we have groups like Fratelli d'Italia in Italy and most likely Rassemblement National coming in as well. But we need to be aware that fascism never makes it in on its own. It always has its allies. In the past, it was Chancellor von Papen handing control to Hitler, or King Emmanuel Victor handing control to Mussolini. Today, we still have that. It's the fact that Macron would work with Le Pen in the past to push through his anti-immigration schemes. The fact that Starmer has already said he'll be... I'll start something up. The fact that Starmer is willing to work with Rassemblement National, and the fact that Suella Braverman got thousands of fascists out the street on Armistice Day. What we need to make sure of is that we oppose them whenever it happens. We call out their accomplices for supporting them, and we make sure that when people like Tommy Robinson come to the streets, we have thousands of people there, not just revolutionaries, but trade unionists and activists ready to call them there, ready to call them out for being Nazis and block them from getting in. And if you want to do that, if you want the best arguments to bring more people out, I think you should join the Socialist Workers' Party.
Okay. I think when it comes to fascism, like, you don't have to argue with people that it's bad, but I think the arguments that we need to have are how we fight it. I think the way that fascism manipulates and infiltrates the working class is such an integral part. I'm from Cardiff, not far from Llanelli, and basically the situation in Llanelli was that a hotel that was going to house refugees, it was a functioning hotel, they basically said they're closing, they didn't tell their staff found out through the news, and the fascists swooped in before we could even get there, and claimed to be friend of the workers, and how refugees have caused all this, 100 people lost their jobs. And I think that the fact that they had the footing in terms of being a friend of the workers allowed them to manipulate the situation where a lot of people in Llanelli who, I wouldn't say are fascists, I wouldn't even say who were necessarily racist, were then swept up by these people who push this racist rhetoric. And I think it's so important that we have these arguments, especially with trade unions, because the trade unions in that area were very poor on it. None of them would come out and actively, openly condemn the far right. They wouldn't do it. All their statements talked about the workers and how they supported workers. They wouldn't even talk about how they supported refugees. And I think it's about making the connection to say that we support the rights of workers, but that is not at odds of refugees. That is not at odds of migrants. These are the arguments that need to be made, because when they are not made, we leave a gap, and that gap is where the far right try and fill it. After this, we had another incident in St. Athens, where far right were trying to mobilise against Afghan refugees. In this situation, it was completely different, where we were able to mobilise people, but these people we mobilised were actually from the Palestine movement. You know, these people who've been, you know, radicalised in this movement, where we were constantly talking about, you know, all the world issues. They then came to the aid of refugees in that situation. So it's also not having arguments with, you know, unions, but always having arguments within the Palestine movement of why the Palestine movement should be anti-racist, anti-fascist, and should be, you know, there to protect all, not just for a certain few. So I think these are the type of links we need to make when it comes to fighting fascism in the UK.
Let's forget what the SPD, the centre-left, actually did. Number one, they called in the Kaiser's generals, and they called in Hitler himself, to crush the workers. Number two, they advocated the ban on the self-defence militias of the proletariat in 1920, or allowing the legalisation of the SA. Number three, they backed Hindenburg in the presidential election against the communist candidate who later appointed Hitler. We now see that in them, as now, the liberal centre are traitors. They will back fascism at every turn. And I will say now this as well. The CDU are working with the AfD, the Republicans in France are working with the National Front, and the People's Party, the centre-right People's Party, are working the far-right in Spain. We must now remember something, and I'm going back to a quote by the General Secretary of the Communist Party on this matter. Fascism is capitalism in decay. I have quite different perspective, I will admit. I believe that we must not collaborate with the left wing of fascism. We must not collaborate with those who seek to destroy us, because I tell you now, the Labour Party are against strikes. They're against anti-war protests. When we say that we oppose genocide, they say that we are terrorists. And because of that now, I believe that we cannot compromise on our ideals. We cannot say that we will accept cooperation with those who seek to destroy us and our movement. And I say now that the choice lies ahead of us in the future. Capitalism will not survive. The question is simply, will it be fascism or will it be socialism? And I hope now that today we will say we will fight, but it will be socialism that will replace this wretched system. Thank you.
Look, I admire the passion of the last speaker. But he accurately describes the strategy of the German Communist Party in 1932. Which by... You know, and it's not a question of ducking the criticisms of social democracy and all that. It's about detaching their base. The German Communist Party was heroic. You know, people fought physically, were killed, right? But they were sectarian and isolated. And it was the road to Dachau. Dachau was set up to put political prisoners in. They found themselves finally united with social democrats in the concentration camps, right? And the Communist Party bore responsibility for the success of Hitler. Right, so we have to learn these lessons and think about what it means to build a mass anti-fascist movement. And simply denouncing either fascism or capitalism isn't going to be enough. We have to have strategy and an organisation to implement it. Look, for fascism to succeed, you need millions of votes, but you need more than that. You need the streets, and not just street demonstrations, you need street fighters, paramilitary organisation, prepared to have physical confrontation with the left and with the trade unions. Hitler got 33% of the vote in 1932. Julie mentioned that Rassemblement National got 33% of the vote. And you see this across Europe, they have comparable votes. Hitler had 100,000 stormtroopers in 1930, 300,000 by 1932. There are fascist street groups, but they number in the hundreds. They are emboldened in France. There are attacks on trade unionists, the left, occupations, LGBT, but they're in the hundreds. The strategy of the Nazis in the 21st century is to use state power to recast the state in a more authoritarian direction to expand their base. I do not agree with the argument that says they will only have to have votes. To me, that's to say that the crisis will never deepen and they can't start to translate millions of votes, which they have, into street movements. Therefore, the situation is urgent. It's not hopeless, though. It's not hopeless, far from it. We have immense reserves on our side of anti-racism and look at France. The fascists could put hundreds on the streets. Our movement put 800,000 on the streets just a few weeks ago. The question is turning that into something that doesn't just protest, but is directed at the fascist organisations, to unmask them, to say these are fascists, therefore they shouldn't be allowed in the public domain, they have to be isolated, they shouldn't be allowed to meet in the church hall or have a stall in the marketplace. You have to drive them out of that public space. And it cannot just be the we have to draw in people. We don't say, but are you a revolutionary? If you're not, I won't march with you. You have to say, do you hate the fascists? We have to march and not just vote. You have to build a united front. And I'm sorry, the Communist Party in Germany failed to do that. That's the challenge. Why have they never been able to consolidate them? The first time I came to Marxism was 1989. The fascists in France had 2 million votes. Now they have 13 million. In Britain, we've had the BNP, the NF, the EDL, the football, because they can't consolidate themselves so far, can't be complacent, because each time we have smashed them, because the better part of the far left has drawn in the wider left, rooted it in the movements, and built movements like the Anti-Nazi League, like United Against Fascism, to smash them. This is the lesson. We've got a lot of things wrong in Britain. This is something we've got right, and we have to keep on doing it, because it's an urgent lesson around Europe and beyond.
A couple of quick things then. I thought what Matthew said from France was very, very important. The point about the normalisation of the fascists and how big an aspect that is, and that they've had a whole strategy of suiting up and trying to look respectful and everything else. But racism is absolutely at the heart of how they're mobilising, and therefore for us, I think when we are talking about what kind of strategy and what kind of method we have to build a mass united campaign against the fascists, anti-racism, obviously, I mean, it's obvious to us here because in Britain that's how we've organised, but we obviously have to fight to make sure that anti-racism and taking on the racist arguments that do catch a hold inside the working class movement is a really, really important thing. And the question about exposing the fascists, obviously I think it's horrific that Marine Le Pen, Tommy Robinson tried to turn up on demonstrations against anti-Semitism and act. This is a very, very manipulative tactic that is about trying to work towards Islamophobia being the new anti-Semitism and trying to drive wedges and so on. Like Marine Le Pen and the RN have had a whole series of problems where various of their candidates have come out with like deeply Islamophobic, yes, and also anti-Semitic comments that they're trying to kind of firefight those aspects, like all that roots of the sort of fascist politics of anti-Semitism and so on is very much a part of what's behind the mask. And I think similarly, Giorgia Meloni, who's tried to claim that she's distant from herself being a fascist, even though she talks about Mussolini as being a hero and so on. There's a whole scandal that's blown up where one of the youth wings, and obviously the building onto the youth is a big focus of the fascists, has been exposed as singing Nazi songs and Sieg Heiling, and she says, oh well, the problem is that there shouldn't have been this private expose. Now, it's horrifying. So I think that the task is that we have to work together and build unity, but it is unity in action, and it is not at the cost of diluting our politics of what we have to say about the system, but we have to build that unity. And in Britain we've got a very strong tradition of it, which is why the far right and fascists are so weak. But we can't take that for granted either. I mean, I think if Farage gets elected, Reform UK, you've got a situation where the fascist movement in particular is extremely weak in Britain, but things can shift very, very quickly. And like if Farage gets a seat, if there's all that kind of realignment that goes on the right with the hard right of the Tory party and so on, and Robinson's endorsed Farage, Robinson's invited Farage to speak. I should say I don't think he's agreed yet because they're working out all these tensions, and it's right to say that Farage is not a fascist and there is a differentiation. But this whole, I mean, just look at what's happened in Clacton, all that stuff about the normalisation of the P word. If that had happened, even 5 years ago, like the context would be different. Actually, like already just in this election campaign, you can feel the difference on the streets around these questions. So I think that my 2 points to sum up. One is on the 27th of July. Tommy Robinson is planning to take over London. We cannot have a situation where there's a small number of us, committed as we are, standing there. We're fighting very hard. We're sort of lucky and prepared, I suppose, because it's not luck, that we have part of a united campaign here called Stand Up to Racism, that demonstration already has the formal backing of about 10 or so trade unions, of the Muslim Association of Britain, of Jewish faith groups and so on, of the People's Assembly, of these big organisations. But we need those organisations to mobilise, and that means that I think Stand Up to Racism groups and people, wherever you're from, you can find out where your local group is, but you can also join the SWP, because the revolutionaries are at the heart of that process of making sure that this resistance is built and that unity is found. And get involved and be part of building the coaches to come on the 27th of July, but don't just buy a ticket, be part of going around and contacting all your local union branches. Go and see if you can do, canteen announcements in colleges and so on. Let's get as many people in the broadest way possible on the streets in London on the 27th of July, because going back to the Hitler quote, we need to crush the nucleus. Yes, they're weak in Britain, but we need to crush the nucleus. So the last point, very, very last point, is about the need for revolutionary organisation. If you look at the lessons and what Mark has touched upon about the mistakes, the dire catastrophic mistakes of the Communist Party in the 1930s, and the failure because of their politics of the reformist socialist parties and so on to offer any kind of solution, there is a real need for us to have an organisation that learns from history, that can understand the nature of capitalism and the nature of our exploitation of it as workers, and how that produces the seeds of not just fascism but also the shitty conditions that we live under in every which way you look at it. And we've had a mass movement on the streets over Palestine. There's a lot of despair that you could look to about what's happening right now, but we shouldn't despair and we shouldn't be panic stations. We should see that there's a polarisation going on, and we want to fight to build the insurrectionary, revolutionary side of that can fight for a better world and deliver it, and therefore people should join an organisation, because we need one to make sure that we can organise that struggle. So please do join us.